I'm also here in the capacity of the Varkey Foundation as an advisor to the Board of Trustees.
I hope nobody else is going to go and talk about how many years they've been in education, because I will eclipse all of you on that one, and it's embarrassing for me, but it's amazing. So, Samir.
My name is Samir Sampath. I'm the co-founder of Global School Leaders, and we work to support school leaders in India, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Kenya.
Thank you, Samir. Laura?
Great. I'm Laura Brown, and I'm the CEO of PEAS, which is a network of 32 not-for-profit secondary schools in Uganda and Zambia.
I think they've been a little bit modest, really, because I've got a sheet here that says all of the things they've done. And Karen's been involved in so many things, really, and many of them have been around leadership development. And you know that movement that we've had away from management into leadership, and then from leadership into a followership, and actually developing others as well as self. So there's an awful lot more that can be said about Karen. I'm sure you'll Google her later on. Samir, co-founder of a not-for-profit. So we've got a number of not-for-profits in the room. Previously, he was in India. He's done work incredibly in narrowing the gap between the most privileged and the least privileged in America. That is incredible in terms of the racial changes that have happened there. So he's a really bright boy. And Laura, well, I don't know where to start, really. Actually, she worked in rural, underserved communities, manages 31 schools, educates over 15,000 young people, employs 800 staff. She's come all the way through from starting off as a Teach First person right through to the CEO, and has worked in Rwanda, India, and Thailand. So these people are bright, bright people. So let's see what they have to say. Our topic for today. See, I can't even barely remember the name of the topic, and they've got to remember all this stuff. How can school principals be agents of change? So they're each going to say a little bit about that, starting with Karen.
I knew you were going to say that.
I know you did, because I told you at the start. I'm going to start.
Okay, so a typical leader, I thought I'd reframe the question and to how can school principals be catalysts of positive change? And I'll give you the answer in a nutshell: by creating a movement, pushing boundaries, and being disruptive. So the Varkey Foundation strapline is changing lives through education. And for me, that's most teachers, when you say to them, why are you a teacher? They'll tell you that they want to make a difference. You've heard that one before? Mm-hmm. And so really, I think that we're talking about social justice and social mobility. That's my mission, social justice, generational change, agency, but particularly equipping children to be engaged citizens through curriculum intent and implementation and impact. So I've always promised myself that as a systemic leader, I wanted to have a local, a national, and a global reach. So part of my global reach, in fact, started here probably about 6 years ago, maybe before, but in a really effective and impactful way, when we first talked about a leadership program, possibly doing something in Argentina, and in fact, I've been involved in the work that the Varkey Foundation has been doing around leadership development in Argentina, and there's probably about 5 states now with more to come. And so that's been really impactful, because that's about change which is at system level. So it's, yes, you have leaders, maybe head teachers, principals, and their deputies who attend a program for a period of time, but it's really about trying to affect change in the entire system. And that's been really effective. There are some statistics around that, which I'm sure you would be able to get at some stage. But the main thing, you know, a colleague of mine just asked me just before we came in, what's my main message? My main message is ethical leadership. I do think that sometimes as leaders, because we're so results driven, that we use that as an excuse to be bullies. And so I always talk about standing between a rock and a hard place, on principle, in the dark night of the soul. Do many of you recognize that? Normally about 4:30 in the morning for me. So we always talk about brave and courageous leadership, but I'm now prefacing that with kind, brave, and courageous leadership. And we were taught a Swahili word yesterday in the main plenary room, which was to speak up, Zusha, speak up. And that's our role as leaders. If anybody's in the room, we are the ones to speak up. And we were also reminded by Mark Pollock yesterday about the sometimes challenges choose us. And so we also have to be the ones to choose challenges. That's our role. Listening to another conversation yesterday, this is because I've got the Magnificent Seven. We're on 5, so don't worry. So our role is to bridge ideologies. There has to be some consensus, I've heard. There has to be some collaboration. We've been using that word quite often. But that's also to create that perfect storm, that ideal climate for effective change. Because we're the gatekeepers and we're the game changers. So we have to respect the process and the people. That's the human capital that we've been talking about in order to take them with us. But remember, with power comes great responsibility. So we have to think about autonomy, and we also are accountable. So accountability versus autonomy. And that ambition that we have for our children, high expectations, no excuses, and that ambition which is beyond potential. And it's part of the honour and the privilege of serving our communities. And the last one I would say is what we call at my school the 5 R's, and I've managed to break those down into 5 R's for leaders. So being resourceful, relationships, really important in terms of exploiting our networks, that's the catalytic aspect of it. And being reflective, the power of coaching and shadowing. There's a program that I am with my London reach, Getting Ahead London, where it's basically executive coaching and shadowing, and that's the effective components. Being resilient, but also particularly in this room at the moment, we're talking about being agents of change, being risk takers.
Thank you, Karen. Samir, follow that.
That's going to be tough. I guess I should start by saying I'm very humbled to just be on this panel. Sir Chris and Karen, having been principals yourselves, and Laura with your network of schools, I mean, I think you guys actually exemplify this idea of principals as change agents. I'm also very excited that this is on the agenda at the conference. I've been coming to GESF for the past few years, and I always really appreciate how teachers are honored and respected. And I always feel like if we could do a fraction of this for our school leaders, I think it would go a long way in appreciating them as well. And I really love the fact that this room is packed. And if I was more bold, I would tell you all to take out your phones and take a picture and tweet to Vikas that we should do more about school leaders. But I think just in terms of this question of school leaders as change agents, I was talking to Karen yesterday a little bit. I think it really depends on the context. And so my context is working in India, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Kenya. And I think what we've seen there, the first step towards leaders as change agents is what I call avoiding the avalanche. And what I mean by that is, when we first started this work in India, I was shadowing a lot of principals and trying to understand what was happening in their day-to-day, what were the decisions they were making. And I remember one of the first visits I did was to a small school in East Delhi that was probably like half the size of this room, and it had 100 students. It served 100 students, about 6 classrooms. And I spent 5 hours with this principal, and every time he tried to leave his office, there was this avalanche that pushed him back into his room. And the avalanche was like people like me and NGOs that wanted to implement programs. It was parents, students, it was government people asking for stuff, it was vendors coming in to sell textbooks or tech stuff. And this is not just unique to that school or to India, it's like across the network that we've seen. And so for me, initially when I first saw that in our team and we were talking about this, we said, okay, this is an easy thing to solve. Leaders just need to prioritize or delegate or time manage. And what we've seen is that these tactics, they don't stand a chance against avalanche, right? And like the avalanche is like all-encompassing, very hard to defeat. And so what we found is that the leaders who are able to kind of take a strangle on their time are the ones who really have a strong vision for their school, and not just, more specifically like a vision for the student experience and what students are learning, what they're feeling as they're in the school. And the leaders who have this very concretely in terms of academic, social, emotional, the kind of interplay between students, they are then able to kind of deploy a set of strategies to really make change in their schools. And so those are the leaders that we find that are able to be change agents.
Thank you, Samir. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Laura?
Great. So the school leaders at Pease schools in Uganda are the best secondary schools in the country. And I'm not just saying that because I'm totally biased, but also...
yes, you are.
but in 2017, there was an external study that showed that to be the case. And the same study showed the link between strong school leadership and higher student learning levels. And very specifically, it showed the link between the instructional leadership element of the leader's role, and that being the highest predictor of student learning. And when I say instructional leadership, I mean the part of the leader's role which is about leading learning. And it might sound obvious to many people in the room that driving improved teaching and learning should be a priority for a school leader. But actually in the context that Pease works in Uganda and Zambia, that's often not the case. And principals perceive themselves to be and are perceived to be more like school administrators or school business managers. And so for me, from a very personal perspective, it didn't take an external study to sort of show me that instructional leadership was the most important thing, because it became very real for me when I was a trainee secondary school teacher myself. And I can remember one day standing, it was the end of the day, my classroom was empty, and I was just surveying the complete chaos and debris that my Year 8 class had left behind. There was crisp packets everywhere, empty bottles of high-energy drinks, and I just had that sinking, desperate feeling in my stomach of like having got through another lesson and had failed to create any learning in my classroom. And it was about surviving the 60 minutes. It wasn't really about teaching and learning. And my school leader at that time, a head teacher called Mrs. Lion, who was about 6'3" and actually looked a little bit like a lion, came into my room while I was having this wobble, and she literally took me by the hands and said, "You know, that 8-3 class, they're a great group of kids, but I appreciate that they might be a little bit hard to handle as a trainee teacher. So what we're going to do is, and for as long as it takes, I'm going to plan your lessons with you, and I'm going to team teach, and I'm going to co-deliver your lessons with you until we crack this nut." And it took nearly half a term of her working with me and supporting me in my classroom. And we did it. And she really brought my teaching practice along. So when we're talking about change, that was my biggest moment, like biggest period of change as an educator. And it wasn't just change for me as a teacher, it was change for my students who finally could learn something because, you know, she'd held my hand through this process. So it's not just in, you know, contexts where instructional leadership is very much deprioritized. It's also in the UK today as well. It's just so important to prioritize instructional leadership. And, you know, head teachers and principals with the avalanche in the UK with all of the competing demands, so easy not to prioritize that part of the role, but just to remember that that really is kind of the core of what's going to make the change for our students.
If you don't mind, I'm going to just ask you a supplementary question, each one of you, a different one based on what you've just said. So it'll be slightly different for each one of you. But Karen, can you just, because you said social justice was really important to you, how do you know if you've been successful in changing things for our children?
So the success, you don't often know how successful you've been, but you know that you've been successful because, of course, there has to be that impact, and we're always evaluating. And I'll give you a nice example. So we had last Tuesday 12 children who we took to Oxford University, and they spent a day there. And on the way there, one of the young girls who told me that she was, I was her best friend, she told me that when she was in Year 1, so when she was maybe 6, So we thought it would be really good because these are children who wouldn't necessarily get an opportunity to even go to university, what says, to just plant that seed of hope. And so on the way there, she was feeling sick, and on the coach, she feeling unwell. And when she got there, she felt a bit unwell. And when we unpicked it, and in fact, I had lunch with her just before I left to come here, and she said that she felt that she was worried that someone was going to ask her a question that she didn't know the answer to, and she was just really worried sick. And then when she got there and she, went through the day, she felt a lot better. And so she said, I told my mum that I would like to go. I'm going to ask my mum if I can go to that university. And I went home and I asked my mum, and she said, yes, I can go to Oxford University.
Good.
So,
Hope she does.
so this is not just for Elisha. This will be Elisha's children, because we know the stats on educated women and their children and what happens. It will be Elisha's children and Elisha's grandchildren. So we don't often know how impactful we've been, but we know we have.
Well, I think that's worth a clap, don't you? That's a pretty good answer. And once an educator, always an educator. My newest grandchild is called Amari, which in Swahili means strength. So I wish you Amari in terms of that.
Thank you.
So, given that I'm sure many of the people that you talked to, Samir, have no idea what an avalanche was, because I don't think you have many avalanches in Africa and India. However, how did you manage to help them to pick and choose what were the essential things that they should let through the gate?
Yeah, I think it's a kind of to Laura's point about instructional leadership, and really the key shift for us was in helping them redefine their role and to say what are the outcomes that are most important for you to think about, and really how do you focus that on student learning. And then based on that, then kind of work your way backwards into saying that, so then if my end goal is improving the outcomes for my students and their experiences, then then how do I prioritize? Then how do I delegate? But I think without that kind of core piece in terms of my role as a school leader is as a leader of learning, then the kind of prioritizing and all that is not very effective.
And that's a really nice segue straight into what you were talking about, Laura, because you were talking about leading learning. But actually you did something else as well. You disarmed everybody, because here you are, incredibly successful, but you talked about your weakness. You talked about something that wasn't going so well, because actually most people in the room will recognize that they've had lessons that didn't go so well, or maybe you're moderating a session, it doesn't go that well, or whatever it is you're doing, and you know that honesty is the best thing. And actually sometimes showing a weakness, showing that something didn't quite work, allows something to flourish and go forward. If you're the expert all the time, you're unlikely to be successful or carry people with you. So in that leading of learning, and that lesson you learnt with Miss Lyon, how have you gone about ensuring that people learn and are happy to share their mistakes?
Gosh, well, that's a really difficult one, actually. And so in the context I work in Uganda and Zambia, I think people find it quite difficult to share their mistakes. And we had a situation at Pease where, so we have a school inspection process, and part of the school inspection process is that the school leader does a self-evaluation, a self-inspection before the Pease inspectors go in. And sort of, about 8 years ago, we were at a stage where all of the school leaders were giving them top marks on every category because it was just really difficult for them to do otherwise. Yeah. So actually sort of saying, if you have the insight which is actually accurate, that makes you a great school leader, and marking yourself top marks all the time is not great. But also we need to sort of recognize as well that this is about feedback is such an important part of that journey of being able to kind of recognize your mistakes as well. And feedback can be quite an individualistic thing, and I think in the UK it's something that I'm quite used to, like having people all through my career giving feedback, having opportunities to give feedback, treating feedback like a gift. But it's not the same in all cultures, and something that I tried to do early on at Pease was to implement a school observation feedback model, because I felt that that would be like a good way of doing teacher professional development. And the teachers were so deeply uncomfortable that it was not an effective exercise at all. And actually, then we figured out, what do our teachers respond well to? And it's feedback in a group. So now we have a learning walk structure where our teacher trainers and our school leaders go around and they look at all classrooms and they pick out common themes and they give feedback to teachers as a group. And then that was the starting point for people to be able to, face up to the fact that, some things aren't going so well, but doesn't have to be terrifying and intimidating. And from there, we then did a sort of softer transition into the one-to-one feedback, which is going better now.
Thank you. The focus of what we're talking about is around leadership. And Karen, I'm just wondering, because you've had a lot of experience of developing systemic and systems leadership in a range of different countries. How do you go about encouraging people to stop being a teacher and actually become a leader of a group of people, a principal, a head of school, head teacher, whatever?
I'm glad you've asked me that question, because Samir and I had that conversation yesterday. And I don't see it as a binary. I don't see that you're a teacher or a leader, or a teacher, then a leader. Actually, I had to do this slide, which is about my leadership journey. And actually, I remember that leadership journey began with responsibility at secondary school. And it continued from there. So in the teaching profession, when our teachers are newly qualified teachers, their leadership journey begins there. They are leaders of learning within their classrooms and for the 30 children or however many children they have in their class. And then they are leaders of maybe people leadership in terms of year group or curriculum. It tends to be curriculum first, so maybe a subject. And then there will be leadership of, never coordination, leadership, never management, but leadership. Leadership of people, leadership of more people, and so on. So there should be an expectation of any of the teachers like yourself, Laura, who, when you talked about that instructional relationship you had with Miss Lyons, from the get-go, that was also your lead-in to leadership. And so I would hope that we would encourage all of new qualified teachers, and also just, it's the whole theory of leaders being born, not made. I have to dispel that. Leaders are made, and leaders have been leaders way before they were leaders. Bless her. That's not my sister.
I was going to say.
My sister.
It always helps when you have family members in the car. I have 17 of my own around the back. Actually, there are quite a few principals in the room. Give a wave, the principals in the room. You lovely people. Yeah. Thank you for coming. Samir, can you expand on that? But sometimes it can be a bit samey if we ask everybody exactly the same question. Yeah. Can you just flip it a little bit into how you're developing different leaders in different countries and how you're seeing them come through, and some of the different challenges you're facing in different countries? Because, for instance, in Kampala, it's very different from Nairobi, and I haven't just spent some time in both with the same schools doing the same sort of things, totally different. So can you just talk about that, Samir?
I think like one point on encouraging teachers to be leaders, I think we have to look at first where are the gaps. So for example, in Indonesia, what we see, and I think this is across our network, is that 65% of the teachers are women, but only 35% of the leaders are women.
Yeah.
And so there's a clear gap in leadership potential there. So I think really thinking more deeply about how we select leaders. That's kind of step one to this whole thing. I think we, in a lot of the countries where we work, the leaders are generally selected by either seniority or politics. Yeah. And so how do we be kind of more thoughtful about actually picking these folks out? And the leaders that we want are the ones that are really passionate about teaching and learning. And so how do we then kind of define the role so that that's what the role is about, and it's not seen as an administrative role. Mm-hmm. So we talk a lot about, one big push we make is we make all the principals call themselves school leaders. Seems like a small tweak. A lot of times they call themselves administrators or some equivalent to that. But that's an important change, that they're not administrating the school, but they're actually leading the school. I think, in terms of the actual, once you have leaders in place and you're trying to train them, there's a lot of differences across the countries, both kind of culturally and policy-wise. So I think the big thing is, I can get into more details later, but the big thing is really kind of taking advantage of what's there. So for example, in Indonesia, there's already kind of a culture of principals coming together to collaborate, essentially, and share ideas. So how do we kind of promote that more? Because we found that to be that was an unintended consequence of our programming. That the leaders, we thought we were doing workshops and school visits, and that was how it was driving the change. But what we're seeing is that when the leaders come together and share ideas, that was also kind of equally impactful. So I think taking advantage of some of that's important.
I think it's ever so easy when somebody gives an answer for you to lose some of the incredible things that people are saying. So basically, you're tackling the fact that there aren't enough females as leaders. That's an incredible thing to do. You're actually changing it from being an admin role into actually the around education and what we're doing in schools. I think we're all fighting that, everywhere, but you're actually really doing it and seeing a difference. That's, it's quite, I am in awe that people can do these sorts of things and actually make a physical change in their countries. Because as Karen said earlier, actually, if you change the lot of women in different societies, you can actually change that culture and the whole way that the country progresses. So some incredible work going in there.
Just to clarify, we are on our way of doing these things.
We're
We have a long ways to go.
We're all on a journey.
Yeah.
And it's easy to get caught up in thinking that you're successful. So for instance, even in GEMS, in this area with 50 schools, we only had 26% of our principals were female back in 2015. At the moment, it sits at 52%. And, it's easy to give yourself a clap on the back. And then when you look and see how many female teachers there are in the schools, you think, we've got to go twice as far again. Exactly. So we're all on journeys. But the thing is, once you get the bus moving, you're on the journey. And sometimes it's good to have a clap on the back and say, well done.
So Chris, can I just add just a tiny bit to that? We had that conversation yesterday, which was about, I think it was spurred from, in the UK, we have the National Professional Qualification for Headship. And to address that disproportionality, we now, this time last year, started a women's only NPQH. And that's been really powerful. And there are other qualifications which are just below that: senior leadership, middle leadership, and the new women's only senior leadership, national professional qualification, again accredited for senior leadership, is going to be starting in June.
Thank you. Laura, so your slightly different question is, you're working in countries in Africa where you can see qualities in other people and sometimes they can't always see them in themselves. How would you go about persuading people that the leader is inside them and you're helping to bring that leader out when they might not even recognize it themselves?
That is definitely true. I think Samir mentioned there's in the places where I work, there's a prevailing culture of kind of deference to age and qualification level, which means that people don't see themselves as a leader unless they have done a certain number of years and are a degree holder. But in reality, in Uganda and Zambia, in rural areas, that counts out a lot of people. And in the Peas network of schools, we privately hire and employ our teachers, and we've managed to instill a culture where people get promoted on merit, and their classroom practice is taken into consideration, and we look for potential and values alignment, so we get a broader range of people and more women encouraged to apply. But we do also have a couple of schools where we sort of manage government teachers, and the norm there is to have usually the oldest male with the highest qualification level becomes the school leader. So we get this group of government teachers that kind of report to our school, and it's our job to pick the school leader out of that group. So we have this open process and we say, come on, put in your applications. There's only ever one. So because everyone sees expects it to be this person who might not actually be the best person for the job. So it's taken us quite a long time to kind of like change the culture, and it's about incentives as well. How do you incentivize people? I mean, we talk about school leadership development a lot, but actually the other part of the picture is about accountability structures and supervision as well as that support. So how do you build in on both the training and development side, but also on the accountability and performance management side, those things that you want to see, those positive behaviors that you want to see in your school leaders?
So on your previous question, you actually mentioned change. And on this question, you've mentioned culture. And I think that leadership is around changing the culture. The only ever-present constant is change. So you get them moving, and when you're on the movement, and as you said, Samir, you don't actually ever quite reach there, but you are actually moving. And then you find different vehicles, even if it is only a women's only MPQH. But it's one of a series of ways in which you keep opening doors. You don't close doors, you keep opening doors. Now, you do get a chance to say something. You do. And look at that, we've got some hands up straight away. So I have to say, I love your hat, sir. So you are going to get to answer the question. But that lady there was first. So if we can go to that lady there, and then the gentleman with the headgear. I do like that. Which country do you come from? Pardon? Nepal. I like your hat. I might pinch your hat before you leave.
So my name is Nadia Naviwala, and I work with the Citizens Foundation in Pakistan. We hire only women in our nonprofit school system, so all female faculty of 12,000 female teachers and principals, and have very sophisticated management systems for hiring and doing performance management of principals based on capacity, achievement, relationships, borrowed from Shell, plus passion, which we added. The thing is, we're in conversations with government in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, where Malala is from, which has had a lot of problems with the Taliban, on school leadership, because they're very interested in it and want to try to adapt our systems. The problem is that they don't have any control over hiring. So the system already has head teachers, and they have about 30,000 schools, and they can't hire 30,000 principals. The other problem is, so they have no control over who they've hired in the system. They don't have control over performance management according to these metrics, because you can't fire anyone either. So what they're thinking of doing is creating an external staff where one person in the field is in charge of several schools. But it just adds to a 10-layer bureaucracy, which is another issue. So my question is, what advice can we give them? And as an example of the public sector, where school leadership is so critical to quality, and yet these are the constraints. So I'm just wondering what is possible there, because there is a sincere will to try to introduce something, and the finances are there as well.
Okay, so I am going to though say, I'm going to ask you to make sure there is a question always in there, and there was a question at the end, and I'm going to ask you to truncate it as much as you can when you do ask a question. And then I'm only going to, if that's okay, have just one or two people answer rather than going around everyone, so that we can get in as many questions as possible. So does anybody want to take this question?
I'm
yes,
open.
Samir.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I think first off, one person for you to speak to is actually standing right in front of you, or sitting right in front of you. Cheryl leads our work in Malaysia, and she's doing a lot of work on this in a policy level of like how do you actually kind of lift some of these constraints. But I think just more generally, we've also worked in systems that have a lot of these constraints, and we approach it kind of in two ways. I think one is we say, even within the given constraints, like how much can you show the impact of school leaders within that? And we've found that there's actually quite a bit. So a lot of times when we think of constraints, it's kind of things external to the control of the principal, which there's definitely a lot, like from a policy level and a community level. But we're also finding that a lot of the constraints have to do with the leaders themselves and how they think about their roles and where they use their time. And so I think one approach that we've tried to do, and we're kind of seeing how successful it's being, is let's work within the given constraints before we even talk about the constraints too deeply, and kind of showcase what happens when you actually invest in leadership. And once you're able to show that, look, this excellent school leader is able to do all of these things, then maybe that changes the policy conversation a little bit. So it's maybe not as satisfying, right? But at least that's the first step that we've taken.
Thanks ever so much. So hopefully you'll connect with each other afterwards. Thank you. The Nepalese gentleman.
Thank you very much. My name is Dharmendra Bhattrai. I'm from Nepal, the country of Mount Everest. I have questions. We are very much confused about leadership in my country. When we talk about leader, everyone wants to be leader, but they cannot change. So we are seeking change makers, the leadership in making change. So especially my question is, should school head teacher or principal be academic leader or administrative leader?
Ooh. So should
Uh,
the
or
school
both.
Should the school
So,
leader be the
since,
leader of academics or the leader
yes.
of the administration, a CEO, or both?
Yeah.
So we
So,
have a range
since
of options.
in my context, Nepali context, a head teacher or a principal is overall responsible for financial management, administrative management, and even academic management. So we are not getting good change in our context. So
Thank you.
my question is this one.
Thank you very much indeed.
So I have-
Yes, Laura.
So I have, it's maybe a cheat of an answer, but we implement a practical solution in our schools in Uganda and Zambia, and that is that we have 2 school leaders for each school. And we managed to make that fit in the financing structure with just some tweaks around different salary scales for differentiated leadership, so it doesn't cost more. But we have one school leader who is called head teacher, and they are the head of the teachers, and they own instructional leadership, and they also do the management of the teachers. And then we have the person who is the school business manager or the school director who takes care more of the kind of business management side of things. And both are required to be leaders. Both have a really specific focus. One of the challenging things that you then need to add on top of all the difficulties about being a leader is that you have to teach about and develop collaboration, because it's not always easy to work in a team with split accountability, so getting the accountability structures is right. And I think, the Education Workforce Initiative that came out of the Education Commission is looking at this very question at the moment in our workforce, not just at the school leader level, but teachers and also classroom assistants. How do we do this thing called task shifting, where we're really making sure that the right people in the system are carrying out the right task, because there's inefficiencies in having a head teacher doing admin tasks, and there's an inefficiency in a teacher doing some task which could be automated or could have a teaching assistant doing that task. And it doesn't mean deprofessionalizing those roles, it's actually increasing the professionalism, because you're getting them to do the stuff that really is at their pay grade. So maybe you could split the roles.
So you could split like that, but actually, Karen, in your system, you'll end up with different forms of governance and one person. Do you want to talk about your system?
I was thinking when you were speaking about strategic leadership and operational leadership. And so as school leaders, we have to discern. So in fact, we have 2 meetings a week, one which is strategic and one which is operational. I would say that my deputy head teacher deals with a lot of the operational. And so it clears my head for that strategic overview. We always talk about strategy, culture eating strategy for breakfast, but we actually do need to have that strategic overview so that we can always be thinking of the bigger picture. We have leaders who think in this way, and we have leaders, the leaders that you want to have and to inculcate in your system, who are thinking this way and also this way. Sorry, I've got very long arms. I should have been a boxer. So always think about that strategic view and your strategic response. And if leaders are thinking in that way, they will always be effective.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you. The young man here in the second row. Actually, this young man was up for International Principal of the Year, so let's see what his question is.
Thank you. My name is Simon O'Connor. I'm Principal at Jumeirah College. I obviously can only talk from my own context, but one of the things I've noticed is that our workforce is changing. Whether we like it or not, we now employ millennials and will continue to employ millennials who have a very different value set. 15 years ago, creation of leadership opportunities was often sufficient. It no longer is. We're being asked what will be the compensation, what will they get in return. So I was asking, I'm intrigued to know how the panel have changed their approach to developing leadership in the context of the changing workforce that we have in front of us.
So The opportunity to show that you can adapt and flex. Who would like to take this one through?
Yeah, I'm happy to.
Happy, Karen.
It's because I have a millennial at home, so I know exactly what you're talking about. And we keep saying they're made of snow, so no offense in terms of the kind of melting aspects of snow. Anyway, so I think it's about an expectation, going back to that expectation of making them want to do this. I don't really want any reluctant leaders in my school. I don't want people who are going into it for the wrong reasons. Anybody who went into teaching for the money is in the wrong job. And so if you're there for the right reasons, I'm happy to work with you all day long. I think that we need to stand our ground on that. I think going back to what I said about that expectation of leadership from the get-go, and that's the best that I can offer you, really, in knowing the expectation. I think there's a sense of entitlement that millennials sometimes have. Also, therefore, let's make it a reciprocal arrangement then. Maybe there does need to be some bartering.
Thank you, Karen. Anybody else want to come back with millennials? No?
I mean, I just...
It's as
Safe.
simple as that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will come to you in a moment. That gentleman at the back there was next, I'm afraid. And then I will come to that lady there. Thank you. That's your sister.
Yes,
Yes, we've got to make sure your sister gets a question.
absolutely.
Okay.
Okay,
Sir.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Jay. I also work at GEMS First Point School. And it's really just a building on Simon's question, actually, because we've talked a little bit about the systematic change of leadership and about being change agents, which I fully agree with. But I want to come back to kind of who's changing the world, and based on those millennials and what they want and what we need to offer as a school, I'm concerned as leaders that we aren't doing enough in order to change education in terms of what we offer. So my question is, talking about the effective research on what effective leadership is, there's a plethora out there of that, but it's based and measured on outcomes, on attainment and school inspection judgment of what leadership is, where it's not necessarily on the outcomes of success for students and our children long term as adults. So my question is, how much can we as leaders, or should we be pushing back at the very top to say this is what education should be, this is how we should be measuring education? Do we do enough, in your opinion, to actually really change?
So that is
the
a
way we
really
teach?
good question, isn't it? Because actually around the world we have too many leaders who are too quick to actually bring about whatever government wants to change in education. And very often government hasn't got a clue what they want to do about education.
I wasn't going to say that, but I have just spoken to Mr.
And I
Blair.
realised I was told we're being filmed and be careful, but I'm at such an age it doesn't really matter anymore. But their primary purpose is to get re-elected at the next opportunity. Our purpose is to educate the young girl who might have a chance to go to Oxford and therefore change all the family that comes in after her. So we have a different level of responsibility and a different higher calling. So who would like to actually start off with how we might actually address this? How do we actually push back and say, no, actually education is more than just about qualifications and examination results?
This is the question about policymakers and what we're making sure policymakers do.
Yes.
So we can talk all day long in this room and then go out and have a lovely lunch, but what have we changed?
Yeah.
And so if we have a message that we're going to take back to policymakers all over the world, because the world is represented in this room, it's that we want to be part of the conversation. Quite often we are not negotiated with, knowing the difference between consultation and negotiation. Yeah. We are consulted, but we're not negotiated with. So we need to be the policymakers at all levels. We in the room need to become the policymakers. We need to insist on negotiation, and we need to take it from the top, but also be part of the top.
Thank you. Samir?
I mean, I think the context I work in is very different, but I will say that I do feel like school leaders, to Karen's point, they do need to be a part of these conversations. So to your question, I would push back quite a bit. But like you going at it alone, or an individual principal going at it alone is probably not the approach. So how do you actually kind of network with your peers, come to some consensus, and then kind of take that forward? Because I mean, any program that is happening in a school needs to have the voice of principals. And one of the frustrations I have in the countries we work is there's all kinds of programming happening in the school, but they rarely take into account the principal as the owner of that program and the change maker in that program. which to my eyes makes no sense. I mean, we would never do that in other industries where, you know, let's only train the frontline workers in business or in hospitals, right? We train leadership as well. And somehow in education, I feel like that layer is a little bit, it's missing.
And that's what Mr. Varkey was saying day one yesterday,
Yeah.
that really you had to have the teachers, the educators in the room and part of the policy making. And actually as part of that discussion around how you have systemic change, if you don't have the educationalists in the room, you end up meeting politicians' needs rather than making for systemic change.
Yeah.
Laura, what pearls of wisdom do you have?
I definitely would agree that it's about getting school leaders' voices heard. And I can't remember which one of you said earlier, it's about status of school leaders. So there's a huge effort around increasing the status of teachers in most systems. And that's a lot about recruitment of teachers and attraction of the best people and retention. But from the context I work in, there's hardly any of the same about school leaders. And actually, I think there's an assumption that school leaders are respected because they tend to be respected within their community. But it doesn't mean that respect translates at a system or policy level. And so what in Uganda and Zambia, within the government system, there is a pay scale which goes up between teacher as seen as a civil servant up to the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Education. So there are so many layers, and school leaders are actually down here. So people, like there is, particularly for rural head teachers, there is a kind of sense of looking down upon school leaders. And I think only when school leaders, the status of school leadership and school leaders like pay and terms and conditions are improved, that actually they will have a genuine seat around the table. It is appalling that if you go to the Ministry of Education, you see school leaders that have travelled on a bus for 8 hours, sitting on a bench outside a civil servant's office waiting for something to get signed off, to be told that that person has gone off to lunch and they'll have to come back another day. That's just like a really disrespectful, and we're not going to get those voices into policy making until there's something structural that shifts as well.
One of the things I experienced when I did some work with the NIE, the National Institute of Education, and the Ministry of Education in Singapore, was that actually a principal could be given you were assigned to a school for 5 years in a term maybe, and then you had a second stint, and you may well end up going to a competitor school. So you weren't competitors anymore. That's made the principals work together in a collegiate way. But after that, you could actually go and work for the ministry, same pay, for 3 years, and then you could go back into being a school leader.
Fabulous.
And what was incredible was there was this equivalency between the people, because they all knew, I'm going to be back in your shoes at some stage, you're going to be in my shoes, and we're going to work together, and I know you've done it because I've seen you do it, and now you're doing it alongside. So there are models out there that actually can show that it doesn't have to be this top-down approach while you're waiting for somebody while they go and have their lunch, to actually working collaboratively and collegiately. The lady, where are you? There you are. And then after you, I think we've got time for one quick question. John, you're the question after that.
Thank you, Jonathan, for giving me this platform to speak. Okay, my name's Mansoura. I work here with the KHDA, and it's a great discussion going on. One of the questions I had, especially bouncing off from what Laura said, it triggered my thoughts. We're looking at well-being in education. So we've looked at student well-being and now adult well-being in schools. So as school leaders, I'm curious to find out what you're doing with regards to well-being in your respective countries.
Thank you, Mansoura.
Thank you.
Somebody to answer this one? But we'll only have one person if it's okay, and then we'll have one person to ask John.
What would you prefer?
Go for
Yeah.
it. Put your hand up.
They're so friendly and collegiate. Go ahead.
So I know that the government are insisting that there is, insisting, so it's a very strange word, that there's going to be a mental health and well-being leader within schools. And so we're currently having some training, and that's at all levels. And there's a cross, I suppose, all the way through school in terms of support staff, all admin, everybody. There's going to be representation, which will ensure that we are all trained in looking after each other and recognising mental health and well-being, and also making sure that there is somebody who has a responsibility for that within schools. At the moment, we all have that. We kind of do that to a greater or lesser extent. I find that for me, that's a major thing. And as much as it sucks me dry, I have an open door policy and all of that, And I had the ear of, my school has 930 children, 150 members of staff. I know 150 secrets, and all of that is part of the mental health and well-being of the team. But it's a reciprocal arrangement, because if you give, you get tenfold.
Thank you. Samir, did you want to answer that as well? I don't mind.
I mean, like from our perspective, a piece of what we're working on is kind of safeguarding and kind of along these lines, and it's around like how does the school a kind of welcoming space for all the students and the teachers? So it's things like corporal punishment. You know, how do you start eliminating that from what's happening in the schools? How do you start rewarding and recognizing teachers and the leaders, because oftentimes they're getting like 15, 20 pieces of negative feedback and then kind of one piece of positive feedback comes trickling in. So I think those are kind of the things that we're working on along these lines.
So I'll just say though that given that we've got schools in Southeast Asia, Africa, India, America, I'd have to say congratulations to you, because nowhere in all of the schools we have, 86 schools around the world, the care and well-being and the kindness and the happiness that comes through from the Ministry of Education and the KHDA here is something different. I don't see that in any of the other countries in the same degree. And that real thoughtfulness about mindfulness for young people, for teachers, is an incredible gift of this area. And I just think that sometimes the regulator can get a thank you very much indeed. So thank you very much indeed. So John, you're the last question. And I say John because John should be as proud as punch, because his son won the 1,500-meter gold swim in the Special Olympics last weekend. And we all wore our multicolored socks. I even had to go and borrow a pair of multicolored, because I am that boring, for Down Syndrome Day the other day. It was a special day, and it was so lovely to see your son smiling and being successful. Connor Conway. If you
Thank
get
you.
to
It was all him,
that.
not me. I can
Yes,
barely
it
swim.
was. Yeah, it was.
I'm John, as Chris said. I'm a principal down in Abu Dhabi. And in my meandering career through leadership, I read somewhere that the pinnacle of leadership is called the executive leader. And for that, there's a sort of paradoxical blend of humility and strategic vision. And the humility bit is accepting that as a leader, you might not be the best at anything in your school, but you have the ability to find out who is. And my question is sort of a statement, but on that basis, I think I see leadership, and I talk about leadership in my school amongst admin and leaders. And it goes back to something that I think Laura was saying earlier, that our role as administrators isn't to be the most important people in the school. The most important people in the school are the kings and queens who are the teachers in the classroom. And if we treat them as the kings and queens, we can really focus on teaching and learning. And I think my question is, do you agree with me that we should be concentrating on our core business and ensuring that our teachers, as administrators, we make the classroom somewhere where our teachers can be at their best and can promote the best teaching and learning and explore that creativity, so that we truly do develop leadership in those areas of our schools as we grow and evolve?
Thank you.
I don't know if that was a question.
No, it's
but
clear.
Really
I'm only going to, I'm sorry, because of the time constraint, I'm going to let Laura have the last question, because Karen and Samir answered the one before. So Laurie, on the spot, can they all be kings and queens?
I mean, I definitely think, I agree with you that instructional leadership and like putting the teachers at the heart of everything is like absolutely the case, and making life easier for teachers. So teachers in Uganda and Zambia might have a class of 100 and 120 kids, and so like they're dealing with like such big challenges that I think that doing anything to alleviate pressure on teachers is really important. I would say though that for me, it's the kids who are the kings and queens in our schools. And so it sort of goes down each layer. How do we flip it so that it sounds corny, that the student really is at the center of everything we do? In a hierarchical society like Uganda and Zambia, often the kids are at the bottom and be seen and not heard type. So actually elevating both the status of the teachers but also the students is something that's a real a journey and a priority for my organisation.
Well, I think that the future of education is very safe in your three hands. And it's wonderful we finish on a point where we say that it's about the children, and the children are foremost, central, and up front in all of our systems. And I wish you well as you go back and actually try to implement systemic change and changes in leadership in your own respective countries. And I wish to thank Laura, Samir, and Karen very much indeed for today. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, Laura.